International efforts to eradicate smallpox in the 1960s and 1970s provided the foundation for efforts to expand immunization programs, including work to develop immunization supply chains. The coronavirus that caused COVID pandemic and eventually brought the human society to disruptive halt like never before, once again brought the world's attention to the importance of vaccines. During the pandemic, we heard, "No one is safe until everyone is safe." We heard it again and again. It is said that vaccination is the second most economical and effective healthcare intervention after clean drinking water, considering the number of lives it has saved and the healthcare development it has enabled. It is a global health and development success story. The distribution of vaccine is as important as the discovery of them. A well-oiled supply chain network is at the core of any effective mass immunization program. Recently, my attention was drawn to a short film called "A Dose of Health, a Dose of Life." It explores the fascinating world of vaccines, the deep intent, the scientific rigor, the complex dynamics, and the spirit of collaboration. The vaccine is proof that science too can produce miracles, and this film brings this out beautifully. To discuss the discovery and distribution of vaccines, I have with me Dr. Priyabrata Pattnaik, a research scientist with deep interest in vaccine research and development, seen in the short video, who beautifully narrates the story behind the story of vaccines. Dr. Pattnaik, so happy to have you join us for this interview.
My pleasure.
Let me start with, what was the reason for you to anchor something like this?
Involving myself in the areas of vaccine is something very close to my heart. When I was growing up at the age of 18, I had the near-death experience because of malaria, and I myself have suffered innumerable times, specifically 14 times. Malaria many different times, hepatitis and cholera, being grown up in a tribal area in the remote part of Orissa in India. I think that kindled a deep desire to be in the space of vaccines to make a difference. And that's why I passionately pursued infectious disease as my study, and that keeps me going in the areas of vaccines and vaccine development.
When I look at what happened in the last 3 years, what has been quite unprecedented in the discovery of vaccines to fight COVID virus spread was the speed at which vaccines of various types were discovered. Much credit to be given to the advanced technology available to the scientific community. But as a scientist, did you at any point in time doubted or questioned the scientific rigor in the process of vaccine discovery and its efficacy?
There was no doubt about the scientific rigor. I think people need to understand the vaccine that was launched was not for routine immunization, but for emergency authorization. There is fundamental basic difference. Emergency authorization was designed a vaccine to cut down number of deaths, is to cut down or reduce the burden of healthcare or on hospitalization efforts. Whereas a routine immunization is for a vaccine that would prevent in a long run, has well studied, well understood. When pandemic hit, the need was very different. The need was to save life. The need was to ensure that there is no burden on healthcare. And for that reason, vaccine was developed, was rolled out. That's why each and every vaccines were called. Till date, majority of them are still categorized under emergency authorization. Very few has gone into routine immunization. I think they have done the job what it was supposed to, save life. Anybody who got a dose of vaccines, I'm sure, avoided hospitalization, and that was very clearly understood. So, in my point of view, the further evaluation of the vaccines to be approved for routine immunization is still ongoing. It doesn't stop there. So, the scientific rigor is still followed. The best advantage that was taken is the prior knowledge. The scattered knowledge that existed in different domains. When the pandemic happened, it was all came together in a very concerted effort to bring out a vaccine as quickly as possible. And that time the disease scenario was evolving. We did not very well understood what is this virus in our hand, how it is going to behave. whatever basic understanding we had, with that, a vaccine was rolled out and it did its job. So to me, that's nothing less than a miracle.
In the recent past, we also heard questions raised about the efficacy of the some of the vaccines administered in the case of COVID. As a scientist, how do you counter some of them and build trust among people about vaccines?
There is a confusion because most of the time people did not listen to the real scientific content. They relied on possibly press or media, and a lot of manufacturing company were openly trying to market their vaccines with the rate of efficacy or protective index as their marketing strategy. But fundamentally, the intent, as I said earlier, was to save life. If you got a vaccine, very likely you were not hospitalized. The disease severity was less. But what has happened that, like COVID virus is an RNA virus and it is destined to mutate. And that was exactly has happened. And the virus evolved over time and it mutated much faster than what scientists anticipated. And it is very difficult when you are running in a war footing mode to think deep enough. Whatever knowledge you have, you need to roll with it. And that's what it has happened. And the mutation rate was so faster that every time there is a new variant that got introduced and started spreading. So even though there was some immunity that existed because of vaccination, the immunity was not enough to counteract the action of the variants. I think that is where it went wrong. But this is beyond our control. Many viruses just don't mutate that much. And if you take one dose of vaccine, you will remain lifelong protected. Whereas COVID was not that kind of virus that you can take one dose and remain protected. The other thing that also came to our knowledge that the duration of immunity, that we need to stay long enough. In case of COVID, it was not that long. It required boosting after a certain time. And unless you do and roll it out, you won't know. If you'd have been a routine immunization, this would have been studied. But for an emergency authorization, there is no time. We just need to ensure the vaccine is available as quickly as possible. So we learned over time that duration immunity are less. The vaccine that was developed with the original strain was not protective enough to the variants. And that is where it created a lot of confusion or apprehension in general public that possibly the vaccine is not working because they missed a critical point. This is to save life, to reduce the hospitalization, not necessarily to lose your life, but a routine immunization is to give you long-term protection that requires multiple years of clinical evaluation. And that is what exactly going on for all the COVID vaccines today.
Okay, let's for the moment move from discovery to distribution. That's what I'm more interested. If discovery of vaccine for COVID was a challenge, it was equally challenging to have the vaccines distributed to every corner of the world and to ensure the supply chain integrity of vaccines of various types and nature are maintained till the time a person receives it. How do you look at the logistics of the COVID vaccine distribution that happened first in the month of December 2020 in the US and even today? What went right? What went wrong? How do we improve if something had gone wrong?
I think what went right was building capacity and infrastructure around cold chain. The tremendous amount of boost that happened across the globe because there are vaccines. Most of these vaccines actually require cold chain, whether it is 4 to 8 degree or minus 20 or defreezing. These cold chain infrastructure were built on a much accelerated manner, though reputed supply chain organizations already had them, but not everybody had them. So a tremendous amount of capacity building in terms of cold chain that has happened. I think the other thing also happened is to take that dose of vaccine to the last person on a remotest part of any given country. So that actually stretched the supply chain and distribution network to far-reaching points where it never used to be. I think what did not go very well is there are certain countries, they went on hoarding more than what was required. That actually questioned the equity and distribution of the vaccines, and stockpiling eroded trust because some of these richer countries had much more vaccine available and stored more than the number of population that they had. And there are several countries did not get the vaccine in time. Though government has built infrastructures like COVAX, where the supply chain was a key focus on sourcing and collecting at one place, stockpiling and distributing. But some way that did not meet the expected timeline, primarily because there was shortage of vaccines and other poor or developing countries were not in a position to do what most of these developed nations did. So bottom line, supply chain, distribution system, maintaining cold chain and access to the remotest part became much more strengthened. But the stockpiling and hoarding by well-established and rich countries eroded trust when it comes to equity and distribution.
Like I said in the introduction, something that we heard again and again during the period of COVID pandemic and the vaccine distribution is no one is safe until everyone is safe.
Yep.
We are 3 years since the world went down to the virus, and the world population today is about 8 billion plus. Are we safe? Is everyone safe, according to you?
It's a paradox. It's very difficult to say, are we safe or we are not safe? But we need to understand we live in a world of a VUCA environment, volatile, uncertain, ambiguous, and complex. And in those circumstances, knowing we have encroached into environments, forests, and places, and natural reserves, and the exploitation that has happened to a certain extent, where there are more and more diseases actually jumping off from animal source to human. The genetic disease transmission rate are much higher. And if you look at WHO's priority list, there is something on the number 1 called disease X. Nobody knows what the disease would be, but this is called priority 1, disease X. That means at any given time, you have no idea what would be the next virus or a next bacteria or a next disease that will actually jeopardize the global situations. So at this point of time, if we're considering COVID, the virus is still mutating. Vaccinations don't perceive a bigger risk of COVID. It's still manageable. It's still mild. Though the deaths are still occurring, the disease is still there, much lower prevalence. You don't know, and you can never be certain and sure that when the next virus or next pandemic can happen. We just need to remain alert and should be in a position to cope based on the learning of the previous episodes.
Did the extraordinary challenges that we faced during the pandemic because of stringent lockdown measures by countries, lack of transportation mode, what was the damage to the world population when it came to other routine, regular vaccination programs, immunization program for other major diseases? And what do you think will be the way forward in the future if the world faces a similar or even a bigger crisis?
I think during COVID, the whole focus of every nation went for COVID. That actually neglected many other disease programs, tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, and you name it. There are many, many disease programs got neglected because the focus was somewhere else. When I say neglected, the attention was less, the funding was diverted towards COVID. The bigger damage happened, all the ongoing clinical studies that was going on with the patient because of the lockdown, they could not able to come to hospital for collection of samples or blood or follow-ups didn't happen. That actually damaged a lot of the clinical progress for vaccines or drug development for other diseases. The other issues that I think that has happened is because of the segregation and isolation, the psychological aspect of all human beings being social became very evident. People understood and had more appreciation for psychological consequences of social segregation and isolation. I think that was one thing that happened. But what got boosted is pandemic preparedness. People realized, governments, planning authorities, pharmaceutical companies, everybody understood that you need to have a pandemic preparedness plan. That pandemic preparedness plan is, at the simplest term, your ability to scale up when an emergency occurs. And you cannot scale up operations unless you have the necessary drills and a plan of actions. Earlier, government has pandemic preparedness plan only involving hospitals or clinical practitioners or a pharmaceutical manufacturers. People forgot that supply chain is extremely important, distribution is extremely important. You need to have every stakeholders into one place to do a pandemic preparedness plan. And that became very, very evident. Now I am seeing a remarkable change in the pandemic preparedness plan. 10 years, 15 years ago, what I was involved during flu outbreaks, swine flu or bird flu, or even Ebola situations in Africa, Now, when I'm seeing a pandemic preparedness plan, they are far more robust. Key stakeholders are involved. And that is also understood that you need to think of broadly protective vaccines. You need to build in-country capacities. And these all the things that is currently doing and going on well when I'm looking at the current situation.
Dr. Pattnaik, the frequency at which disruptions happen in the world today are far more and they are of global proportions. So, what is your advice to supply chain professionals and how do you recommend they build resiliency into their supply chain?
I think the biggest struggle and challenge that I see is sustaining the motivation for pandemic preparedness. As the pandemic slowly fizzles, the attention becomes less. We all come back to normalcy. You won't see in public people wearing masks or doing hand sanitization. Those guards are generally down. When that happens, sustaining motivations and a business relevance of pandemic preparedness many times fizzles out. I think logistics and supply chain organization cannot afford that. Knowing the critical role that they play in the vaccine supply and distribution, the sustained attention and motivation to build that pandemic preparedness to quickly scale, ramp capacity need to happen. I believe all the logistic partners need to be trained and qualified with disease outbreak emergencies. Even the last person delivering something need to know and they need to be trained and qualified on that. We need to sustain the capacity of cold chain distribution network that we have built. The concern that I have is we have built capacity during influenza outbreak, but as the outbreak went down, the sustenance was difficult and they slowly turned down those infrastructures. We should not be getting into the same situation again. So when we have built sustainable cold chain infrastructure, we need to sustain it so that in future situation, we are ready. I think what is also important, the way we do fire drills for any establishment, for every supply chain, it is essential to do a mock drill to simulate an emergency situation and how do you quickly reappropriate shipping containers, flight routes, consolidation of consignments. The emergency preparedness plan need to be very deeply looked at. Having said that, I just also need to caution you that in military or an army, there is a saying that no matter how well you prepare and how strongly you are trained and you have done the drill, when the real situation happens, it will be dark, it will be raining. What I'm basically saying is we need to continue having these training programs and developmental activities among each and every supply chain professionals involved in a supply chain organization to remain ready and agile, and our ability to improvise from the lessons learned will possibly keep us from the next pandemic to become big. And that is where I think a supply chain would possibly play a very critical role, thinking of the next possible thing that can happen.
I have one last question, and I think today any discussion is incomplete if you do not make reference to the influence and impact of artificial intelligence, particularly open AI. We have seen the tremendous growth that it has, and it could help in the discovery of vaccines and also distribution of vaccines in terms of dealing with the data. What do you foresee in terms of the influence of artificial intelligence, machine learning, open AI in the discovery and distribution of vaccines and other medical pharmaceutical products in the future?
That is going to play a significant role, and there is no doubt about it. I can tell you a situation where I was personally involved was to look at a program where we looked at the early signals from social media when people exchange, talk about fever, headache, and those kind of early signals before even pandemic or certain disease outbreak happens. 2 to 3 months before, you will see certain kind of those signals. We taking those data, analyzing it, will give us a projection that where these diseases may have a prevalence or may come up. So big data analytics play a critical role. The other thing is what I'm seeing, the big data analytics is the epidemiological data we are collecting that needs to be churned and analyzed to identify way before an outbreak can happen. But in terms of distribution, I think that fascinates me to a great extent is delivery of vaccines through drones to remote locations where when lockdown happens, when sending something to a doorstep or a remote area is a challenge, drones comes handy. And so artificial machine learning and all those things are playing a significant roles. And the other thing is what I have seen when we were receiving materials for production of vaccines, many times they're getting stuck. And I remember having conversation. I said, why can't you as a supply chain partner look at where the congestions are and give us a forecast that where these congestions and how long that's going to happen, so that we know how much lead time we need to plan for our manufacturing facilities, or anything is getting stuck or getting delayed, how long that congestion will. It could be a small little things, but it actually helps in a much bigger way. And those are all churning big data and making sense out of it and communicating the extract and sense to the stakeholders so that they can make critical decisions on the way.
Dr. Pattnaik, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, and looking forward to such interactions in future. Thank you.